So today I'm just going to talk about a couple things. I think that the themes from looking at the relationship between language models and measurements of human processing language is just amazing. The work I'm going to talk about here just looks at the language models themselves to try to understand how the processing is working inside some of these large language models. But I think it's worth thinking about the relationship between what I'm going to describe here and several of the themes that we've seen from Ben and Ariel and Leah. I think that you'll see some echoes of some of the things and also some opportunities for maybe new kinds of effects to look for. So the basic thing I'm going to talk about today is trying to localize these large computations that are going inside the artificial neural networks, these large language models. Can we, if we were to do neuroscience on them, what would we do? And recognizing that as artificial systems, we have this opportunity to do things that we wouldn't normally be able to do on biological neural systems. And so, oh no, yeah, moving from Windows Mac to Windows, but it's okay. So you have to forgive a little bit of the fonts seem to have dropped. So just predicts the next word. As we know, the nice thing about it is that you can use the word prediction task to evoke a lot of information about what a language model knows. I love the questions that Ben was asking about how much information seems to come from grounding versus the word distributions. And so from just distributional training, these word prediction models actually do seem to contain a lot of interesting knowledge about the world. So for example, if you construct a sentence like Miles Davis plays the blank and ask it, predict the next word, then it'll reveal that the word trumpet should be a lot more likely than other words, sort of revealing some sort of knowledge about the world of, that Miles Davis at least is some sort of engram that is associated with playing the instrument of the trumpet somehow. It's almost as if there's a little database of knowledge inside the language model somehow. So when we're confronted with this kind of question, we want to ask, can we actually localize where this factual knowledge comes from? We have this input, which is just a set of word embeddings on the left-hand side. And the neural network is just a few dozen rounds of opaque arithmetic and then translates to a vector at the output side that comes out trumpet on the other end. So somewhere in this mysterious mishmash of step number 2, this knowledge recall is happening. So the question is, can we understand this process at all? And so what I'm going to show you is one way of doing that. So to locate knowledge of a fact, you can use a method that we call it causal mediation analysis. And the way it basically works is you run the network twice. The second time, you mess up the input. You can think of this as like a disease condition where the network is set up in a way where it can't resolve the fact or the knowledge that you hope it to know. So we put in noise where there's essential input information like the words Miles Davis, and then on the output of the network, it's unable to predict trumpet properly. And then we can ask, well, certainly if we fixed Miles Davis, it would make the second run work correctly. But what we're interested in is internal computations. So we can take internal steps of the computation in an individual piece of state and then copy it over and then inject it into the second run as an intervention. So just at that, so say at the second stage of the neural network, at that location of the neural network, while it's processing the first token, we copy over the neural state that the clean run had into the corrupted run, and we look at, what effect does it have on the output? And I'll tell you, most of the time, it doesn't really make a difference. Most of the time, when you do this kind of copying over, doing this kind of causal test is a little different from looking at correlative tests, because There's a lot of things that correlate with the differences here, but you'll find that if you do this causal check, that a lot of the computations are actually ignored, at least by these transformer models. And so, but once in a while, you bring over a neural state in a certain location, and it'll have this remarkable effect and boost the prediction of the correct word trumpet, which suggests that, oh, that maybe we're on the critical path there for the decisive computation. And so you can trace out those paths, and this is kind of what it looks like. So I picked a little bit of a longer sentence. So Brian De Palma works in the area of film, and we have a data set of several thousand of these kinds of test facts that we can use to probe these models. And what I've shown in purple are the neural states during this grid of computations in the transformer, which have the strongest causal effects. And there's two sites. There's a site at B, the late site, which is really not surprising. These are the states right before the moment when the model's about to predict the word film. And it would be like finding the neural state, which is just causing somebody to utter the word film and then just intervening there. So it's not that surprising that that has a very strong causal effect. But it's also very interesting to see this early site really far away, much earlier, which has really strong causal effects, that if you bring over a little bit of neural state, then it also causes it to say film. You see this repeatedly with all sorts of different types of sentences, as the headquarters of Zillow is located in Seattle. You can do this experiment in different ways. Instead of injecting noise as the second setting, you can swap to a different sentence or a different word and try to swap the neural states between different distributions, and you see a similar kind of effect. This is transforming Shaquille O'Neal plays a sport to Megan Rapinoe. So now it thinks that Shaquille O'Neal plays soccer if you bring over the right state. And so the hypothesis is that this two sort of locations in the neural network, it's really suggestive that maybe factual retrieval is happening at one of the states, at one of the early states. And so so we tested this in a few ways. There's, I'll give you a citation to the paper if you're interested in it. But you can localize it to different types of neural modules inside these things. There's a type of neural module called that we call them the MLP modules. These are feed-forward modules that are different from the attention modules inside the transformer, and they seem to have a strong effect at this early state. And then the interesting thing that you can do is you can go in and ask, well, what do they do? These are just simple mapping association modules. This is very they don't do much, but they map from one vector space to another. So the hypothesis is that if we manipulate that vector space mapping, we might be able to change the model's belief in a particular fact. So we went through our data set of facts and we rewrote them systematically to try to change the beliefs of the networks to associate locations like the Space Needle to different locations, like instead of Seattle, like the vector for Rome. We worked through the math to do this, and this was generally a success. When you do this, you can get the model not just to regurgitate Rome, but you can get it to generalize its predictions in different ways. If you reword the questions and you ask the model how to predict things, it'll tell you when you go in and find food to eat at the Space Needle, don't go look for hamburgers anymore. You should look for the delicious pasta sauce. After all, you're in Italy, right? So, so it has this interesting effects where it's actually quite, it generalizes pretty well, better than you'd expect. And it actually, when we measure, there's a specificity generalization trade-off that we can test to see how well an edit like this actually corresponds to what you would think intuitively corresponds to knowledge. And when you localize an edit like this, it tends to work better than traditional fine-tuning, and in terms of its specificity and generalization. So the green dots here are localized edits, which are sort of up and to the right on this set of various editing experiments, compared to fine-tuning, which is in red, or hypernetwork method, which is in purple. So there's some successes that you see from this. On the other hand, there's still mysteries. So for example, there was really interesting work that came out after ours from Peter Hasse that looked at, he replicated our ability to edit these facts based on this localization that we saw. But then he also observed that he could find other locations in the network that you could also achieve very strong editing effects, which sort of leads to the question, well, if you can edit a fact and insert it all over the place in the neural network, why the heck did the neural network put it where we found it? I think that that's sort of a remaining open question. So we don't completely understand what's going on here. There are some other things that where people have replicated our results, but where it's really been a surprising positive result. So for example, there was a nice reversal curse phenomenon, which is if you have a network processing a fact like Steve Jobs is the CEO of Apple, and you were to rewrite that fact in using this sort of data structure assumption, then it might not actually be the same circuit that's used to remember the CEO of Apple is Steve Jobs, because you've reversed the word order here. And our architectural finding suggests that that retrieval might be a different circuit than the one that's understanding the retrieval in one direction. And then, about a year after our initial suggestion of this form of the circuit, somebody found very systematically on a large scale test that there's this reversal curse. If you use a variety of fine-tuning methods to train facts that are stated in one way, then they fail to get the model to learn things the other way, which is very interesting. I think it's one of these examples of something that we could look for in humans as well. Okay, so let's see, how am I doing on time? Supposed to wrap up. I have another thing I'd like to show you. I'm very excited by. Another 5 minutes. Okay, great. So that's sort of localizing knowledge. And so these large models are pretty interesting because beyond factual associations, they're exhibiting really interesting hints of higher level reasoning. And so we wanted to understand if you could localize some of that as well. So one of the meta-learning phenomena that you see in these very large models is called in-context learning. Let me describe what that is. So if you want to learn something new, so you have a sentence here, commons means typical, right? What if we want to redefine that, like redefine what the word common means, or maybe we want to even redefine what the word means. What if we want to make means mean like the opposite, common means rare or something? What if we wanted to sort of create a neural network that does like opposite world? Well, then the typical thing that we would do, oh gosh, I should have checked the formatting. The typical thing that we would do is to train the model, fine-tune the model on some new task data that demonstrates what we're trying to do. Arrive means depart, small means big, dark means bright. We want to do this opposite world training, so we would give it a number of examples, and then we would test it on some held out examples, like common means rare. And once the model starts to get the idea of how to do it on our held out examples, then we count that as a success. And we figured out how to teach the model this task by fine tuning. So this is traditional machine learning. But what's amazing that these models do is that they can do this without traditional machine learning. So the meta learning way of doing this is, instead of changing the model parameters by applying gradient descent over these types of training sets, the meta learning way is to take these training sets, like this opposite world training set, and supply it as analogy input to the language model. So here we have analogy inputs, like arrive goes to depart, small goes to big, common goes to rare, provided as input. And then when we take our final question, which is what does common go to, we leave that unfinished, and the model has to predict the next word. And if it gets the idea of the pattern that we're demonstrating in the inputs, then it will do this task. And so the big shocker for the very large language models was that they were extremely good at solving this meta learning task without any gradient descent training, without changing the parameters, just by providing the training data on the input. They're extraordinarily good at that, beating many of the traditional investigations on how to do this kind of future training on a bunch of benchmarks. So this was really interesting. It's one of the most fascinating things that we found as language models got scaled up. And so you can ask whether you can localize this as well. And so, so let me zoom through it so that I don't go through the time too much. But basically, the experimental procedure is you can do exactly the same type of thing that we did to localize facts. You can run the network twice, one where the network is doing the in-context learning successfully, and another run where things are frustrated, so maybe you scramble the words, so it's not able to do that, and then you can go hunting around the network to see if you can identify the decisive computation circuit that enables you to do this type of generalization. And what we ended up finding, so this is delicious, noisy, doesn't relate to anything, small, big, goes to common, right? But maybe if we find the right thing to bring over, slow, we go to fast if we bring over the right thing. So we set up thousands of examples like this, looking for what kind of state we could bring over to get things like slow to go to fast, or English to French translation, or other fancier tasks. And what we found is that actually across a range of about 60 different tasks, it was the same attention heads that kept on transmitting the decisive information for the task representations. So we took these attention heads that were consistently encoding the task, and we realized that if you added up the attention head outputs averaged over the task, you get this really interesting vector we call a function vector, which is like a task representation. It's a representation it's just like a word embedding, but instead of representing a word, it's representing a transformation that the model has learned how to do from inputs to outputs. And it has these fascinating characteristics. If you insert it into a context where you aren't, just in natural text context, you can get that transformation to be evoked in a natural text context. So if the transformation was tell me the capital of a country, and you stick it into that neural pattern into the processing of just text about the country, then all of a sudden the sentence will start talking about the capital of the country, or you can have it talk about opposites, or you can have it start explaining things in Spanish. And then it also has these embeddings also have some of the interesting characteristics of like word. A few of these vectors, and you add and subtract them, then you can create vectors that evoke new unseen tasks that were seen before. So there's a little puzzle here that I won't go completely through, but it's like a little crossword puzzle for tasks. Have like 3 different tasks, and you want to compose them. Then what would the 4th task be if you did the vector arithmetic? And it's fascinating. You can get high performance out of a completely unseen task by composing them this way. And so what excites me about this kind of work is that, in artificial neural networks, we can test every step of computation, right? And there's opportunities to do things like causal tracing, which are very hard to do in traditional neural systems. And these things can really localize information flow, and the localized representations reveal this, some structure that's pretty amazing. Editable representations, things like the reversal curves or function composition. So I just put a couple of the papers here. I should probably include more things there. I think that one of the challenges here is that a lot of the interesting phenomena happen when the models get very large. And one of the puzzles that we face is how do we make this more accessible to academics? So one of the things that my lab is spending increasing amounts of time doing is trying to figure out how to create a shared infrastructure that the research community can use to have access to large models. So so that the NDIF project is something that we just recently launched, and that we're looking for creative ideas on how to bring that forward.